The breakfast table looked familiar, yet it no longer felt like mine. The smell of the cinnamon rolls I had baked that morning clung to the air, but the curtains and bowls recently swapped out for Marcy's taste made the kitchen seem like someone else's stage. Marcy's tone was calm, almost rehearsed. She smoothed her hand across her stomach, the gesture deliberate, claiming space as much as attention. "I think it's time you started looking for another place to live," she said. Her words landed with the finality of a legal document, though they wore the disguise of soft concern. I paused mid-motion, the knife still hovering above my toast. My heartbeat betrayed me, uneven against the mask of composure I'd learned over a lifetime. Inside, a voice I dared not speak allowed itself a whisper. "She's already evicted me. Only the walls haven't noticed yet." Across from me, Damon pretended to scroll his phone, his eyes fixed anywhere but mine. That silence was its own confession. "How long?" I asked, my voice even but low, "before this new chapter of yours begins?" Marcy brightened, as if relieved I hadn't made a scene. "Oh, maybe a month. That should give you enough time to find a nice senior apartment. I've actually looked at a few brochures." She slid a folder toward me, my name scrawled across it, like an unwanted label. I didn't touch it. The folder sat, there like a prop, a piece of evidence in a trial where I had no defense. I forced myself to nod once, a gesture of surface agreement. "I'll think about it," I said. My words carried a rhythm. I recognized not surrender, but survival. Marcy's smile returned, satisfied, believing she'd won. Damon gave the faintest nod, still avoiding my gaze, his silence as loud as betrayal. I sipped my coffee, letting the bitterness coat my tongue. The cup trembled just enough to remind me I was still human, not stone. The rest of breakfast limped forward in false politeness. I cleared my plate and rinsed it, the water's rush louder than their voices behind me. I could feel their eyes, though Damon's never lifted. This wasn't a request, it was an eviction, dressed in pastel words. When I stepped outside onto the porch, the air cut sharp and clean, a relief after the suffocating sweetness of her tone. The lake shimmered in the distance, its surface calm, an indifferent witness. And in that stillness, something shifted. I wasn't just being pushed out, I was being called to fight for the only life still mine. The chill sank into my skin, steadied me. Behind me, Marcy's laugh carried faintly through the kitchen window, Damon's murmur blending with it. They thought I would take my coffee, take their folder, and quietly fade into another zip code. But a house isn't just walls. It's memory. It's blood. And I wasn't going to leave quietly, but when I stepped back inside, her voice was already waiting for me in the kitchen, calm, calculated, as if my silent vow on the porch had never existed. Lauren's voice drifted from the kitchen, casual as morning coffee. "The doctor said something interesting yesterday." She stood by the marble counter, one manicured hand on her barely, showing belly, the other swirling a green smoothie that cost more than my weekly groceries. The afternoon light caught her diamond earrings. New ones, I noticed, though Michael's teacher salary could hardly afford such extravagance. I continued deadheading the roses in my small indoor garden, soiled dark beneath my fingernails. 23 years in the emergency room had taught me to recognize when someone was building toward something. Lauren had that particular stillness, like a surgeon selecting the right blade. "Oh?" I kept my voice neutral, though my hands tightened on the pruning shears. "He's concerned about stress factors." She took a delicate sip, her eyes finding Michael where he sat at the breakfast bar, scrolling through his phone. "Environmental stress, specifically, for the baby." Michael's thumb paused mid-scroll. His gaze lifted, caught between us like a bird between two windows. I saw it then, the slight downturn of his mouth, the way his shoulders hunched forward. He knew what was coming. He'd known before she'd even started speaking. "The thing is," Lauren continued, her voice honeyed with false concern, "older family members in the household can create tension, even unconsciously." She set down her glass with a precise clink. "The doctor said it's quite common. The generational differences, the conflicting approaches to childcare," she trailed off, letting the implications settle like dust on everything I'd built in this Victorian townhouse. The absurdity of it struck me with such force I nearly laughed. Stress factors? I'd spent decades working trauma codes, performing CPR on teenagers, holding mothers while they identified their children's bodies. I'd seen real stress, the kind that leaves scars on your soul, not the kind manufactured over organic smoothies. My fingers trembled as I remembered the weight of a stethoscope, the tremor after losing a patient. And now this woman, who thought stress was a chipped nail, was weaponizing medical authority against me. "She's not wrong, Mom." Michael's words came out strangled, as if someone else was pulling them from his throat. He still wouldn't look at me directly, his attention fixed on a spot just past my left shoulder. Maybe it would be healthier for everyone. The pruning shears slipped from my hand, clattering against the terracotta pot. In that sound, I heard the echo of my grandmother's tea set, the one Lauren had already relegated to the highest shelf, claiming it was too fragile for daily use. The same tea set my husband and I had used every Sunday morning for 37 years, his handwriting on little notes tucked beneath my saucer. Another perfect brew from my perfect wife. Those notes I still kept in the library, pressed between pages of first editions. His authentic script, nothing like the formal signatures on documents Lauren kept producing lately. "There are some lovely senior communities," Lauren said, reaching into her designer bag. "Very upscale. Libraries, gardens, social activities." She produced a glossy brochure, its paper thick and official, reminding me uncomfortably of legal documents, the kind with signatures that needed notarizing. Oak Haven Residences. They even have a writing club. She slid it across the counter toward me. The woman on the cover had silver hair and a practiced smile, sitting in a generic beige room that could have been anywhere and nowhere. I picked it up, feeling its weight heavier than it should be, like those documents Lauren had been so interested in lately, asking about wills and deeds with the casual persistence of water wearing down stone. "I spent 23 years in the ER, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the fracture spreading through my chest. "I've delivered babies in the back of ambulances. I've saved more lives than I can count, but please, tell me again how my presence is medically harmful to your pregnancy." Lauren's smile never wavered, though something sharp flickered in her eyes. "It's not personal, Helen. It's just what's best for the baby. Surely you understand that, as a medical professional?" Michael finally looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw the boy who used to bring me dandelions, calling them sunshine flowers. The boy who'd cried when we'd had to put down our old retriever. That boy was still in there, somewhere, buried beneath the weight of Lauren's careful manipulations. But he said nothing. His silence was louder than any accusation. I folded the brochure once, twice, the creases sharp as paper cuts. The afternoon sun slanted through the Victorian windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories I refused to pack away. This house breathed with 40 years of my life, every creak in the floorboards, a conversation, every water stain a story. Lauren wanted to erase it all, make it pristine and profitable. I saw it now with the clarity of surgical lights, the casual mentions of property values, the questions about insurance policies, the sudden interest in where I kept important papers. This wasn't about stress or babies. This was about signatures on documents, about ownership, about rewriting history with the stroke of a pen. "I'll consider it," I said, tucking the brochure into my gardening apron. The paper felt cold against my ribs. ITS, gloss too much like. The notarized documents, I feared were already prepared somewhere, waiting to strip me of everything. I barely had time to fold that brochure away before another appeared that evening, laid out on the dining table like a velvet trap. The brochure landed on the dining table with the soft thud of a velvet hammer, its glossy pages catching the lamplight like a weapon polished for presentation. Lauren's manicured fingers lingered on the cover Maple Grove Senior Living, before sliding it toward me with the practiced grace of someone dealing cards in a game already won. "We'd take care of everything," Lauren said quickly, too quickly. "Michael grew up here. We'd preserve what matters." That brief silence lasted only a few days before they returned, this time carrying something heavier than glossy brochures. The week after Lauren presented that perfectly typed document with its crisp notary seal, I found myself wandering through my own home like a visitor who'd overstayed her welcome. Each room held traces of what it had been, but Lauren moved through them with the efficiency of someone rehearsing for a performance that had already been decided. I'd hear her voice floating from the parlor, that honeyed tone she used with Michael. "We only want the house to feel brighter, more ours." The word ours landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through 30 years of memory. That morning, I discovered the curtains first. The heavy damask ones my husband had chosen for their ability to filter afternoon light into something golden and forgiving had been replaced with sheer white panels that left the room exposed, clinical. Lauren stood beside them, running her manicured fingers along the fabric with satisfaction. "Don't they make everything feel so much fresher?" she asked, though her eyes weren't seeking approval but confirming conquest. Michael stood in the doorway, his gaze lingering on the corner where the old curtains used to pool on the floor. But when I looked at him, he busied himself with his phone. The TEA set came next. Not removed entirely, that would have been too obvious, but relegated to the back of the china cabinet, half hidden behind a collection of geometric vases that looked like they belonged in a hotel lobby. I found myself standing before the cabinet that evening, studying how the delicate roses on the porcelain seemed to shrink behind the aggressive angles of modern design. My mother had served tea from those cups at every significant moment of my life. Birthdays, graduations, the morning after my wedding, the afternoon we buried my husband. Now they sat like elderly relatives pushed to the edge of a family photograph. "They're safer back there," Lauren explained when she caught me rearranging them. "Less chance of accidents." Her smile was perfectly calibrated, not quite reaching her eyes. She wasn't redecorating. She was rehearsing my absence, each removed object a dress rehearsal for the day when I wouldn't be here to object. The cedar chest disappeared on a Thursday. I'd kept it at the foot of my bed for decades, filled with quilts my grandmother had stitched, letters my husband wrote during our courtship, Michael's baby clothes wrapped in tissue paper. When I came upstairs that afternoon, a sleek ottoman had taken its place, its surface empty of history. "Mom, the chest is in the attic," Michael said quietly when I asked, not meeting my eyes. Lauren thought it made the room feel cluttered. His voice carried that particular exhaustion of someone who'd given up arguing before the conversation began. I climbed to the attic that night, my knees protesting each step, and found the chest shoved against the far wall beside boxes labeled OLD in Lauren's precise handwriting. Opening it by the light from the single bulb, I touched each quilt, each letter, grounding myself in their reality. These things existed. I existed. No matter how many mirrors and vases appeared downstairs, these threads of memory couldn't be entirely erased. But Lauren was thorough. I had to give her that. Day by day, the house transformed under her touch. The library's worn leather chairs gave way to something angular and uncomfortable. The kitchen table, where 3 generations had shared meals, was replaced with a glass surface that showed every fingerprint. She worked with the patience of someone who knew the outcome was already decided, that typed will with its official seal, her permission slip to rewrite our family's entire history. Michael drifted through these changes like a man sleepwalking, occasionally pausing at some newly empty space where something familiar used to rest. Once, I caught him holding the sugar bowl from my mother's TA set, turning it over in his hands as if trying to remember something important. When Lauren called him from the next room, "Honey, can you help me with this?" He set it down carefully, but his fingers lingered on the porcelain before he walked away. "Mom, you have to understand," he said to me one evening, the two of us alone in what used to be my reading corner, but was now furnished with a chair too rigid for comfort. "Lauren just wants to make the house more contemporary, more valuable." The last word hung between us like an admission of something neither of us wanted to name. Every vase she moved felt like a sentence erased from my story. The house was learning a new language, one that had no words for the life that had been lived here. I watched it happen with a strange detachment, as if observing someone else's tragedy from a safe distance. But beneath that calm surface, something else was building, a cold, sharp awareness that this wasn't just about decor. This was about erasure, about making it easier for everyone to forget that I had ever belonged here. The final insult came on a Friday evening. The embroidered sampler my mother had stitched "Home is where love resides" had hung in the entryway for 50 years. I found Lauren taking it down, replacing it with a mirror that reflected nothing but the new furniture, the new curtains, the new reality she was constructing. "This opens up the space beautifully," she said, stepping back to admire her work. In the mirror's surface, I saw myself reflected as what I'd become, a ghost haunting someone else's future home. I felt like a ghost, trapped in my own home. Needing air, I drifted outside, hoping the garden might hold a piece of me that the house no longer could. The afternoon sun slanted low across my front yard, casting long shadows through the rose its thorns, a sharp reminder of what remained unspoken, bushes that still clung to their last blooms. I felt a quiver inside, knelt among them with my pruning shears, though my hands worked without thought. I felt a quiver inside, clipping mechanically at the thorns and faded petals. Each snip felt like cutting away another piece of the life I'd known. First, the antiques Lauren had removed, then, the forged will that threatened to erase me entirely from my own home. "Helen, dear, you're going to murder those poor rows," its thorns a sharp reminder of what remained unspokens, "if you keep at them like that." I looked, I felt a quiver inside, up to find Mrs. Grant standing at the edge of my garden, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming teacup. The porch light behind her caught the wisps of silver in her hair, creating a gentle halo effect that reminded me of simpler times when neighbors still took afternoon tea together. "Would you like some company?" she asked, settling onto the worn wooden bench beneath my kitchen window without waiting for an answer. That was Mrs. Grant's way. She'd been inserting herself into my life with gentle persistence for 30 years, ever since she'd moved in next door. I set down the shears and joined her, grateful for the excuse to stop destroying what remained beautiful in my garden. She poured me tea from the thermos she'd brought, the familiar ritual of it steadying my trembling hands. The steam rose between us, carrying the scent of Earl Grey and memories. "I heard about the will," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the amber liquid in her cup. "Lauren's been quite vocal about it at the bridge club." Of course she had. I could picture her there, elegant fingers dealing cards while she casually mentioned her impending ownership of my Victorian townhouse, as if discussing the weather. The thought made the tea taste bitter on my tongue. "It's a typed document," I said, the words scraping past the tightness in my throat. "Notarized. Official." Mrs. Grant made a small sound, somewhere between a hum and a disagreement. She set down her cup with deliberate care, and I noticed her hands that had held countless teacups, written thousands of letters, remembered everything. "That's odd," she said, and something in her tone made me lean forward. "Because I distinctly remember seeing your Thomas writing his will." "Not typing, Helen. Writing." The world seemed to pause, the late afternoon breeze stilling in the roses. "What do you mean?" "It was about 3 months before he passed." Her voice took on that particular quality it had when she was reaching back through memory, precise and clear. "I'd come by to return that book on Victorian architecture he'd lent me. You were at the library that afternoon. It was a Thursday, I think." I knocked, but when no one answered, I walked around back. The French doors to his study were open, and there he was, bent over the mahogany desk with his fountain pen. You know how particular he was about that pen. I did know. The Mont Blanc I'd given him for our 20th anniversary, the one he used for everything important. My fingers remembered its weight, the way the gold nib caught the light. "He was so absorbed he didn't notice me at first," Mrs. Grant continued. "When he finally looked up, he seemed almost embarrassed. Said he was putting things in order, making sure everything was clear for you." I remember thinking how his handwriting looked like calligraphy on that cream paper, not a computer screen in sight. An old friend's memory lit a lantern in my darkness. The possibility of it, the hope, surged through me like electricity finding ground. Yet doubt crept in alongside it, memory against notarized documents, nostalgia against legal seals. "Are you certain?" I asked, hearing the desperate edge in my own voice. "Absolutely certain it was handwritten. As certain as I am that you've been trimming the same rose for the last 10 minutes, she said with gentle humor, then grew serious again. Helen, I've known you and Thomas for decades. That man would never have typed something so important. He believed formal documents deserved the weight of ink and intention. Besides, she added, studying me over her teacup, why would he hide a typed will where no one could find it? The Thomas I knew would have made sure you knew exactly where everything was. She was right. Thomas had been meticulous about our affairs, walking me through every investment, every insurance policy, every detail I might need. The idea that he would have secretly created a will leaving everything to our son's future wife, a woman he'd never even met, was absurd. Yet Michael seemed to accept it, his distance from me growing wider with each passing day, as if Lauren's gravity pulled him into an orbit I couldn't reach. Where could it be? I murmured, more to myself than to Mrs. Grant. If there really is a handwritten will, where did Thomas keep his important papers? She asked pragmatically. His study, mostly. But Lauren's already been through there. Organizing. The word tasted bitter. She's been remarkably thorough. Mrs. Grant reached over and squeezed my hand, her touch warm and reassuring. Then look where she wouldn't think to look. Thomas was clever, and he knew you better than anyone. If he wanted to make sure something stayed safe for you, where would he put it? The question hung in the air as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in my house, not Lauren's, not yet lay the truth. I could feel it now, hidden but present, like a heartbeat beneath floorboards. Thank you, I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being, for remembering, for telling me. Oh, my dear, she said, gathering her thermos and cups. What are neighbors for if not to remember what others would prefer we forget? As she made her way back to her own yard, I sat alone on the bench, watching the shadows lengthen across the garden. The roses I'd been attacking looked ragged but alive, and I thought perhaps that was fitting. Damaged but not destroyed, still capable of bloom. My fingers found the pruning shears again, but this time I set them aside. There was searching to be done, and I had a handwritten will to find. To what? Drive yourself crazy with suspicions? He stepped closer, and I caught the scent of Lauren's expensive perfume clinging to his skin. Lauren's been nothing but kind to you. She's trying to help, and you keep treating her like the enemy. Help with what, exactly? The question slipped out before I could catch it, sharpened by the midnight call still echoing in my ears. His jaw tightened. With the transition, with making things easier for all of us. He gestured toward the boxes. Mom, Dad's been gone for 3 years. Maybe it's time to let some of this go. Even my son turned away. The thought struck me with the force of prophecy, cold and certain. If even my son, the child I'd nursed through fever and heartbreak, could stand in this attic and speak of letting go, then who would stand with me when the truth finally emerged? Who would remember that this house had been filled with love before Lauren arrived to catalog its contents like an appraiser? I see, I said quietly, my hand still resting on the dusty lid of the box. Beneath my palm, I could almost feel Charles's presence, his steady heartbeat that had lulled me to sleep for 40 years. Of course you're right. I should let things go. Michael's expression softened slightly, mistaking my surrender for acceptance. I know it's hard, Mom, but Lauren and I, we only want what's best for everyone. I nodded, watching his face in the dim light. When had he learned to lie with such practiced ease? When had my honest boy, who couldn't keep a secret to save his life, developed this smooth mask of concern that revealed nothing of his true thoughts? You should get some sleep, he said, already turning toward the stairs. Tomorrow's a new day. I followed him down, my hand trailing along the banister Charles had installed himself, running my fingers over the smooth wood worn soft by decades of touch. At the bottom of the stairs, Michael paused. Mom? His voice carried a note of the boy he'd once been, uncertain and seeking approval. Things are going to work out, you'll see. But his words carried the hollow ring of a man trying to convince himself as much as me. After he disappeared into the hallway, I stood alone in the darkness, surrounded by the familiar geometry of my home that somehow felt foreign now, like a theater set arranged for a play I hadn't auditioned for. I made my way back to my room, but sleep remained elusive. Instead, I lay in the dark thinking about midnight phone calls and paperwork that needed to be perfect, about my son's eyes that no longer met mine with the old trust, about dusty boxes in the attic that held more than just memories. In the silence, I could hear the house settling around me, but now its creaks sounded less like comfort and more like warnings. The attic box called to me in the darkness, patient as a secret waiting to be discovered. Tomorrow, I decided, I would return to it not as a woman obsessing over shadows, but as someone who understood that truth, like dust, had a way of settling in the most unexpected places. Charles had always said that the most important things were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And now, like a clock ticking behind the walls, that moment began to count down, inescapable. As dawn began to gray the windows, one thought echoed in my mind with crystalline clarity. Stop digging, Mom. But some things, once disturbed, demanded to be fully unearthed, no matter how deep they'd been buried or how much dust had been allowed to gather on their surface. By morning, lack of sleep had hardened into purpose, and I found myself walking into Mr. Allen's office with the forged will in hand. The law office felt heavier than I remembered, its mahogany shelves groaning under leather-bound volumes that seemed to watch my every move. I clutched the forged will in my hand, the paper damp from my palm as I stepped through Mr. Allen's door. The afternoon light filtered through amber glass, casting everything in shades of honey and rust, but there was nothing sweet about why I was here. Mrs. Helen. Mr. Allen rose from behind his desk, his voice carrying that steady calm I'd known for 20 years. Please, sit. I lowered myself into the leather chair across from him, the forged document trembling slightly as I laid it on his polished desk. The notary seal gleamed like a drop of blood against the white paper. I need you to look at this, Mr. Allen. Really look at it. He pulled his reading glasses from his breast pocket with the same deliberate motion I'd seen countless times before, when he'd helped settle George's estate, when he'd drawn up our original will. His fountain pen rested beside a stack of legal papers, its silver nib catching the light. The smell of ink and old paper filled the space between us, familiar yet charged with new urgency. This is supposedly George's will, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Lauren presented it last week. She claims it leaves everything to her. Mr. Allen's eyebrows drew together as he studied the document. His fingers traced the signature line, paused, then traced it again. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the tick of his grandfather clock. I watched his face, searching for any sign of what he saw, but his expression remained professionally neutral. The signature, he finally said, setting the paper down with careful precision. It's questionable. My heart jumped, but I kept my voice measured. Questionable? How? The pressure points are wrong. George had a distinctive way of lifting his pen mid-signature. Here, between the G and the E. This signature doesn't show that lift. He leaned back, removing his glasses. Mrs. Helen, do you have any of George's original documents, letters, contracts, anything with his authentic signature? Boxes of them, I said, feeling something spark in my chest. Not quite hope, but its cousin. I compared them myself. The slant is off by degrees, the G loops differently. Good. He pulled a fresh legal pad toward him, his fountain pen poised. That gives us a foundation. But Mrs. Helen, I need to be clear about the risks here. Challenging a notarized will isn't simple. If we move too early, without concrete proof of the authentic will, the case could collapse. Lauren could argue you're simply a grieving widow unable to accept change. The word widow stung, even after 2 years. I straightened my spine. And if we wait too long? She could establish residency claims, make property changes that become harder to reverse. His pen tapped against the paper, a nervous rhythm I'd never seen from him before. The timing is delicate. We need evidence, not just of forgery, but of the real will's existence. I thought of Mrs. Grant's words, her certainty about the handwritten will George had shown her. What kind of evidence would stand up in court? The original will itself would be ideal. Failing that, witness testimony from someone who saw it being created or signed, documentation of when and where it was drafted. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Mrs. Helen, think carefully. Where would George have kept something that important? My mind raced through our house. The study he'd converted to Lauren's gym, the bedroom they'd redecorated, the attic I'd already searched. Then I thought of his habits, his peculiar ways of hiding Christmas presents inside books, tucking love notes between pages of first editions. The library, I whispered. He always said knowledge was the best keeper of secrets. Mr. Allen nodded slowly. Then that's where you start. But Helen, he used my first name now. Friend to friend, rather than lawyer to client. Be careful. If Lauren suspects you're building a case, she might accelerate her plans. Work quietly. How long do I have? Realistically? A few weeks at most. After that, possession starts to speak louder than paperwork. He stood, walking around the desk to place a steady hand on my shoulder. The law can cut through forgery, but only if you hold the blade. I rose, feeling taller than when I'd entered. Then I'll find it. Every book, every page if I have to. I'll start preparing the legal framework, he said, returning to his desk. Document everything you find, no matter how small. Take photographs, keep notes. If this goes to court, we'll need a clear trail of evidence. I paused at the door, looking back at him. His fountain pen was already moving across the legal pad, building the architecture of my defense. For the first time since Lauren had raised that glass at dinner, claiming my home as her stage, I didn't feel alone. Truth had another voice now. His. Mr. Allen, I said, what if I can't find it? What if she's already destroyed the real will? He looked up, his eyes sharp behind his glasses. Then we build our case on the forgery itself. It's harder, but not impossible. Forensic document examination, handwriting analysis. There are ways to prove what isn't real, even if we can't produce what is. If lies hid in ink, I said, more to myself than to him, I'd answer with memory. Memory and evidence, he corrected gently. In court, they need to walk hand in hand. I nodded, gripping the doorknob. Thank you. Helen, he called as I stepped into the hallway. I turned back. Your husband was a meticulous man. If he wrote a will by hand, he would have made sure it survived. Trust in that. Walking back through the reception area, past the secretary's sympathetic smile, I felt the weight of what lay ahead. But also, for the first time, I felt equipped to carry it. The investigation was no longer just my desperate scramble through dusty boxes and faded signatures. It had shape now, structure, the backing of law. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to slant toward evening, painting the sidewalk in long shadows. I thought of my townhouse, its rooms slowly being stripped of their history, and Lauren's confident smile as she rearranged my life to suit her vision. But now I had something she didn't expect. An ally who believed me, and a trail to follow. The fountain pen in Mr. Allen's office would keep working through the evening, building my case line by careful line. I could still hear the sound, as if it echoed inside me. Truth had a voice, and I would give it ink. The image lingered, like a shadow, refusing to fade. Days later, armed with new documents and a folder full of memories, I returned to Mr. Allen to hear the verdict on my home. The law office sat tucked between a florist and a bookshop, ITS brass nameplate weathered like an old soldier, quietly defying time, its brass nameplate worn smooth by decades of worried fingers. I pushed through the heavy oak door, my hands trembling despite the folder I clutched. Old letters, bank statements, anything that might prove the house was mine. The receptionist smiled with practiced sympathy and gestured toward Mr. Allen's door. Mrs. Helen. Mr. Allen rose from behind his mahogany desk, his fountain pen catching the morning light. Please, have a seat. The leather chair creaked as I settled into it, the sound somehow reassuring in its solidarity. Mr. Allen's office smelled of old books and strong coffee, lined with law volumes that promised order in chaos. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and opened a manila folder that seemed to hold my entire life. I've reviewed the property records, he began, his voice measured and calm. The deed is quite clear. My breath caught. For months, I'd felt like a guest in my own home, watching Lauren rearrange my life piece by piece. The tea set hidden in cupboards, the family portraits relegated to the attic, even the doormat changed to something sleek and modern. Each alteration felt like an erasure, as if she were rewriting the story of our home with herself as the sole author. In plain terms, Mrs. Helen, this is your house. Mr. Allen's words cut through my spiraling thoughts. Your late husband's will left it to you exclusively. There's no provision for transfer to your son or his wife. The relief hit me like a physical force. I closed my eyes briefly, as if hearing my husband's voice again in the walls that still held his memory. I gripped the arms of the chair, feeling the worn leather beneath my fingers. You're certain? Lauren mentioned something about community property laws, about Michael's rights as our son. She's mistaken. His tone remained professional, but I caught a flicker of something irritation perhaps in his eyes, or deliberately misrepresenting the situation. The property was purchased before your son's marriage, titled solely in your and your late husband's names. Upon his passing, full ownership transferred to you. For months I felt like a guest in my own home. Now I know these walls still remember me. Lauren's been quite insistent, I said carefully. She's already spoken to contractors about renovations, major ones. Mr. Allen's pen tapped against the desk, a staccato rhythm that matched my racing heart. Has she produced any documentation supporting her claim? Only words. Promises that Michael told her it would all be theirs someday. The bitterness crept into my voice despite my efforts. She speaks as if I'm already gone. Well, you're very much here, and legally, she has no claim. He slid the manila folder across the desk. This contains copies of the deed, the will, and all relevant documentation. I'd suggest keeping these in a safe place. I took the folder, its weight both reassuring and damning. That I needed legal proof to defend my own home against my son's wife felt like a betrayal deeper than Lauren's grasping ambition. It was Michael's silence that cut deepest, his inability or unwillingness to stand between his mother and his wife's desires. There's something else, Mr. Allen continued, his voice gentler now. If she escalates attempts to force you out or makes threats, document everything. The law is on your side, but evidence always helps. She's too clever for threats, I replied. Everything is suggestion, implication. She mentions how difficult it must be for me to maintain such a large house alone, how worried Michael is about my living by myself. I paused, remembering last week's dinner. She's been hinting that I might be happier in a more manageable situation. A retirement community, no doubt. Exactly. The word came out sharper than intended. Somewhere convenient for them. Mr. Allen leaned back, studying me over his glasses. Mrs. Helen, I've seen this before. Adult children, or their spouses, who view inheritance as their due rather than a gift. But the law doesn't recognize expectation as ownership. It's not even about the money, I said, surprising myself with the admission. The house, it's where my husband proposed, where Michael took his first steps. Every room holds memory. Lauren looks at it and sees square footage and property values. Then we ensure those memories remain yours. He stood, signaling our meeting's end. If she persists, we can send a formal cease and desist letter. Sometimes legal letterhead has a sobering effect. I rose, clutching the folder to my chest. I hope it doesn't come to that. Michael is in a difficult position, Mr. Allen finished gently. But that doesn't diminish your rights. As I walked toward the door, his voice stopped me. Mrs. Helen, the house is yours. Don't let anyone, family or otherwise, convince you differently. The morning sun hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk. Washington RMER, than expected, like a hand of assurance resting lightly on my shooter, unexpectedly warm for the season. The folder felt solid in my hands, each document a small armor against Lauren's machinations. I thought of her face when she learned about this meeting, the careful mask slipping just enough to reveal the calculation beneath. It's my house. The words echoed with each step. My memories, my walls, my life. I imagined the coming confrontation, not if, but when. Lauren discovering that her carefully laid plans had met the immovable object of legal documentation. Would Michael finally see his wife's true nature when her charm failed against courthouse records? Or would he retreat further into the comfortable fiction that this was all a misunderstanding? The folder grew heavier with each block, weighted not with paper but with the fight ahead. Yet my steps grew steadier too. For the first time in months, I walked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. The deed in my hands wasn't just proof of ownership, it was a weapon, one I'd have to wield at the right moment. And that moment was coming. I could feel it gathering like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and necessary. Armed with that certainty, I knew the next confrontation could no longer be delayed. The eviction notice felt heavier than paper should. I'd printed it that morning on the good stationery, cream-colored, watermarked the kind my husband once used for important correspondence. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was fighting forgery with authentic paper, lies with legal truth. The sticky note on my kitchen calendar still bore yesterday's date circled in red ink. 30 days from now would be March 15th, the date I'd written in careful block letters beneath final deadline. Lauren was arranging white orchids in the front parlor when I entered, her movements fluid and practiced. She'd replaced my grandmother's china vase with something sleek and modern, all sharp angles that caught the afternoon light like broken glass. Half a toasted bagel sat forgotten on the side table beside her coffee cup, the cream cheese hardening in the afternoon air, evidence of a morning routine that felt too casual, too settled in what was still my home. The sight of it made my chest tighten, but I kept my voice steady. "Lauren, I need to speak with you." She didn't look up from her flowers, merely tilted her head in that way she'd perfected, part acknowledgement, part dismissal. "Of course, Helen. What's on your mind?" I set the notice on the coffee table between us, the legal seal catching the light. 30 days notice to quit the premises, as required by law. Now she looked up, those perfectly shaped eyebrows rising in what might have been surprise, if I didn't know better. Her laugh was like crystal, beautiful and sharp enough to cut. "Helen, darling, you can't evict someone from their own home. This isn't your home." The words came out harder than I'd intended, but I didn't soften them. Not yet. Not until the will is probated, and I have every intention of contesting it. She set down her orchid stem with deliberate care, her smile never wavering. "We've been through this. The will is perfectly legal. Michael's father was very clear about his intentions. Michael's father never signed that document." I kept my hands steady on the back of the Victorian chair, my chair, the one I'd nursed Michael in when he was colicky as a baby. "I know my husband's handwriting better than anyone. Handwriting can change over time, Helen. Illness, age, not that much." I pulled out one of Charles's old letters from my cardigan pocket. The ink faded but unmistakably his. This was written 6 months before he died. "See the way he crosses his T's? The angle of his signature? Nothing like that document you produced." Lauren's composure flickered for just a moment, like a candle in a draft. But she recovered quickly, rising from the sofa with practiced grace. "You're upset, I understand. Change is difficult at your age. But Michael and I have been patient long enough." The condescension in her voice made something cold settle in my stomach. This was the woman who'd smiled sweetly at Charles's funeral, who'd brought me casseroles and sympathy cards, who'd played the devoted daughter-in-law while planning to erase me from my own life. Patient? I almost laughed, but it came out bitter. "How generous of you to be patient while stealing my inheritance." "I'm not stealing anything. This house belongs to Michael now, and Michael belongs to—" She caught herself, but the slip was telling. "To you?" Michael's voice came from the doorway, quiet and strained. "What's going on?" Neither of us had heard him come in. He stood there in his work clothes, briefcase still in hand, looking between his wife and his mother like a man watching 2 trains approach the same track. Lauren was the first to move, crossing to him with that liquid grace, her hand finding his arm. "Your mother is having trouble accepting the will, darling. She served us with some sort of eviction notice." I watched Michael's face as he processed this, saw the way his jaw tightened. But there was something else there too, a flicker of uncertainty that gave me hope. "Mom, you can't be serious." "I'm perfectly serious, son. This house is still mine until the will is proven valid in court, and I have every reason to believe it won't be." Lauren's grip on Michael's arm tightened, her voice taking on that breathy quality she used when she wanted something. Michael, she's being unreasonable. We have a baby on the way. Our child needs stability. The baby. Always the baby when she needed to win an argument. I studied Michael's face as Lauren played her trump card, saw the familiar guilt settle over his features. But something made me push harder. Are you certain about that, Michael? About what? The words came out before I could stop them, sharp as broken china. Are you sure the baby is yours or just another piece of paper signed for her? The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the old house settling around us, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant hum of the refrigerator. Lauren's hand dropped from Michael's arm as if she'd been burned. How dare you, she whispered, but there was something hollow in her outrage, something that rang false as a cracked bell. Michael was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Part shock, part something that might have been relief. Mom, what are you saying? I'm saying that if ink can lie, son, maybe other things can too. I kept my voice gentle now, watching him process the words. I'm saying that a woman who can forge a will might be capable of other deceptions. Lauren's composure finally cracked completely. This is ridiculous. Michael, tell her. Tell her how crazy she sounds. But Michael wasn't looking at Lauren anymore. He was looking at the eviction notice on the coffee table, at the authentic paper with its legal seal and careful language. I could see him remembering things, late-night phone calls Lauren took in private, the way she'd pushed for marriage so quickly, the convenient timing of her pregnancy announcement. The due date, he said slowly. When exactly did you say the baby was due? Michael, please. Your mother is trying to turn you against me because she can't accept that your father didn't leave her the house. I picked up the unused teacup from the side table, one of the few pieces of my grandmother's set that Lauren hadn't packed away. The porcelain was thin as an eggshell, painted with tiny rosebuds that had faded over the decades. It felt like holding history in my hands. There's tea in the kitchen, I said quietly. The good Ceylon blend. Why don't we all sit down and talk about this like civilized people? But Lauren was already moving toward the stairs, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood with sharp, angry strikes. I don't have to listen to this. I won't be accused of. She stopped, seeming to realize she was about to say too much. Accused of what? Michael's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath now. She turned back, her hand on the banister, and for a moment her mask slipped completely. I saw something desperate there, something cornered and dangerous. Nothing. I'm accused of nothing because I've done nothing wrong. Then why won't you answer the question about the due date? The question hung in the air like smoke. Lauren's mouth opened and closed once. Then she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. I don't owe anyone explanations for my private medical information. Least of all, someone who's trying to throw a pregnant woman out of her home. She swept up the stairs then, leaving Michael and me alone in the parlor, with the eviction notice lying between us like evidence in a court case. Michael sank into the modern chair Lauren had chosen, his head in his hands. God, Mom, what if you're right? About the will or about the baby? Both. He looked up at me, and for a moment he was 7 years old again, coming to me with a scraped knee and trust that I could fix anything. What do? I set the teacup back on its saucer with care, the small clink echoing in the quiet room. You do what your father taught you, son. You look for the truth, and when you find it, you act on it. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the parlor floor. In a few hours, we'd sit down to dinner as a family, maintaining the pretense of normalcy while everything shifted beneath us like sand. But something had changed in this room. Some balance had tipped. The eviction notice lay on the table like a promise, and Michael clutched it in his hands like a man holding onto something solid in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. The seed of doubt had been planted. Now we would see what grew from it. By the time dinner arrived, the unspoken tension at the table carried every word we hadn't finished in the parlor. The dining room glowed with the warm light of candles I had lit hours earlier, their flames casting restless shadows across the mahogany table that had carried the weight of decades of meals and memories. Michael had arrived with Lauren precisely at 7, her heels striking the hardwood floor with that rehearsed certainty that always suggested ownership. The other relatives, Margaret, James, and his wife, had settled quietly into their seats, the clink of crystal against silver filling the pauses between cautious murmurs. I moved between kitchen and dining room with practiced ease, a hostess's rhythm I had worn for years. Against my ribs, tucked beneath the fabric of my cardigan, the authentic handwritten will pressed like a secret heartbeat. Each time I caught Lauren's eye, she returned a smile polished, immaculate, a mask of victory. She had no idea her theater was about to end. "Helen, this roast beef," Margaret said, her voice soft with nostalgia. "It reminds me of the dinners your husband once hosted." Lauren's fork hesitated, a flicker of annoyance breaking through before the mask returned. She raised her glass, voice carrying with perfect clarity. "We should have more evenings like this. After all, this house will be mine soon enough. To new beginnings and rightful inheritance." The words settled like smoke. Michael shifted in his seat, Hawaii's gaze dropping to his plate, as if avoiding flames he knew would soon rise. "Perhaps you should wait," I said quietly, "before making such proclamations." Her laugh was bright, dismissive. "Oh, Helen, there's no need to be modest. Michael and I have already reviewed the will. It's very clear." I let my fingers rest briefly over the envelope in my cardigan. "Funny you should mention that," I replied, withdrawing it and placing it before me on the table. "I found something rather interesting yesterday." Her smile faltered. "What is that?" she whispered. "The real will," I said, breaking the wax seal with deliberate care. My husband's handwriting unfurled across the page loops and curves as vivid to me as his voice. This is what he left. "To my beloved wife Helen, I leave our home and all its contents, trusting she will preserve the love within these walls." Lauren's wineglass slipped, shattering against the plate, like a promise broken in public. Red spread across white linen, bleeding outward in an indelible pattern. "That's impossible," she breathed. "The one I have is notarized, legal." "It's a forgery," I answered evenly. "Mr. Allen, my attorney, Colorado confirmed the signature discrepancies. This handwritten document, Wisconsin nest and sealed, is the authentic one." Michael finally looked up, confusion and horror colliding in his eyes. "Mom, what's going on?" "Your wife," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on Lauren, "presented a false document 3 weeks ago." Michael turned to Lauren, voice breaking. "Lauren, what have you done?" Her composure cracked. "This is ridiculous. Helen is bitter. She can't accept change." "Change is not the same as theft," I cut in, my voice cold as winter air. Her mask slipped completely. "Fine. Keep your house, keep your son, but don't think this is over." She seized her purse and stormed toward the door, slamming it so hard the windows trembled. For a moment, silence expanded, thick and suffocating. Then, like a house finally exhaling, the room released its breath. The wine stain remained on the cloth, a permanent scar, a prop turned into a warning. And I knew, as I looked across at Michael's tear-bright eyes, that the truth had finally broken through. The door slammed with such force that the crystal in the dining room cabinet trembled, sending tiny chimes through the sudden silence. Lauren's heels had clicked their final staccato across my hardwood floors, each step a punctuation mark to her humiliation. The sound faded down the front walk, swallowed by the night, and what remained was a stillness so complete it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. I stood at the head of the dining table, the authentic handwritten will still clutched in my trembling fingers, its wax seal broken but its truth finally unleashed. The faces around me, my sister Margaret, Michael's cousin James, old Uncle Harold, all wore expressions caught between shock and sympathy, their eyes darting from me to Michael and back again. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words and the weight of what had just transpired. Michael remained frozen in his chair, his shoulders slumped, as if Lauren's departure had taken something vital from him. His hands rested flat on the table, fingers spread wide like he was trying to anchor himself to something solid. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, the words barely audible above the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Not enough, I thought, but a start. The apology hung in the air like smoke, insubstantial and fragile. I wanted to reach across the space between us, to smooth the lines of anguish from his face as I had when he was small and scraped his knees. But this wound went deeper than childhood falls. This was the kind of cut that left scars on trust, on love, on the very fabric of what it meant to be family. She made me believe. His voice cracked, and he stopped, pressing his palms against his temples. She said you were getting confused, that you might, that the house was too much for you to handle alone. The confession hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to remain standing, to keep my voice steady, and you believed her over me. It wasn't a question. The betrayal sat between us like a third presence at the table, uninvited but undeniably real. Margaret cleared her throat gently, breaking the tension. Helen, dear, perhaps we should. Number. The word came out sharper than I intended. I softened my tone, but my resolve remained firm. Let him speak. We've had enough secrets in this house. Michael's hands dropped to his lap, and when he looked at me, I saw the boy he had been uncertain, desperate for approval, afraid of making the wrong choice. She was so confident, so sure of everything, and I felt like I was drowning, Mom. After Dad died, everything changed, and Lauren seemed to have all the answers. Ah, there it was, the truth that had been hiding beneath the forged documents and stolen heirlooms. My son hadn't just been manipulated, he had been lost, adrift in grief and confusion, and Lauren had offered him what seemed like a life preserver. That she had been leading him toward the rocks instead of safety was a cruelty that made my heart ache for him, even as anger still simmered in my chest. Your father's death was hard on all of us, I said quietly, moving around the table until I stood beside Michael's chair. But running away from grief doesn't make it disappear. It just makes it stronger. The smell of spilled wine lingered in the air, sharp and acidic, a reminder of the violence with which Lauren's carefully constructed facade had shattered. Someone, Uncle Harold, I think, had moved the broken glass, but a dark stain remained on the white tablecloth, spreading slowly like blood through fabric. I reached out and touched the back of Michael's chair, not quite ready to touch him, but needing some connection. She's gone, I said, and the words carried more weight than I had expected. They weren't just about Lauren's dramatic exit, they were about the end of something, the closing of a chapter that had nearly torn our family apart. What happens now? Michael asked, his voice small and uncertain. Before I could answer, Margaret stood and walked to the living room, returning with something in her hands. It was the family portrait that had hung above the mantelpiece for 20 years, the one Lauren had temporarily moved to make room for her stark modern painting. My sister hung it back in its rightful place with careful reverence, adjusting it until it sat perfectly straight. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of restoration. In the photograph, Michael was perhaps 12, standing between his father and me in front of this very house. We all looked so young, so certain of our future together. His father's hand rested on Michael's shoulder, and I could almost hear his voice echoing across the years. Family is everything, Helen. Whatever comes, family is everything. Now, I said, looking from the portrait to my son, we remember who we are. We remember that love doesn't mean allowing ourselves to be destroyed, and forgiveness doesn't mean pretending betrayal didn't happen. We start over, if you're willing to do the work. Michael nodded slowly, tears tracking down his cheeks. I want to try, Mom. I want to come home. The words hung in the air like a prayer, fragile and hopeful. Around us, the house seemed to exhale, releasing the tension that had lived in its walls for months. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking not just the end of the day, but the end of Lauren's reign over our lives. As the last chime faded, I felt something shift inside me, not joy, not yet, but something steadier and more enduring. Justice had weight to it, different from happiness, but no less valuable. It settled into my bones like comfort, like coming home after a long and difficult journey. The walls remembered me. They had witnessed my husband's love, my son's childhood, decades of quiet contentment. They had seen Lauren's attempt to erase that history, and they had watched me fight to preserve it. Now, in the settling silence of the night, they whispered their approval. The house was mine again, not just in legal terms, but in the deeper sense of belonging that no forged document could ever truly steal. I looked around at my family, at the portrait restored to its place of honor, at the dining room where truth had finally conquered lies. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, conversations to be had, trust to be rebuilt, a future to be imagined. But tonight, in this moment, it was enough to know that the foundation held. The silence was no longer emptiness, it was a breath returned, a space for healing to begin. In the days that followed, the silence slowly reshaped itself into resolve, guiding me toward what came next. I stood in the parlor after the storm, a porcelain teacup trembling lightly in my hands. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, scattering golden patterns across the shelves where my husband's books still waited. It struck me then this house, like me, had been holding its breath, waiting for a decision about what legacy truly meant. The confrontation with Lauren felt distant now, though only 2 weeks had passed. The broken glass was swept away, her lies exposed, but one question remained: would I lock my truth inside these walls, or let them breathe with new purpose? My fingers traced the rim of the cup, the very one she had mocked as old-fashioned clutter, and I felt the weight of inheritance shift, not as a burden, but as possibility. Legacy isn't about walls hiding secrets, I whispered into the silence, though suddenly the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It's about voices filling the space with truth. The clarity startled me. When I set the cup down, the soft clink rang out like a tiny bell, and the house seemed to stir awake. The choice crystallized. Instead of hiding what she tried to erase, I would honor it. Instead of guarding what I reclaimed, I would share it. This house, almost stolen from me, would become a gift. Within days, the transformation began. I moved chairs and placed small tables just right for conversations over tea. Shelves that once stood like private fortresses became open invitations. Heavy curtains gave way to lighter fabrics that welcomed the sun. My first visitor was Mrs. Grant. "You've done something magical here, Mrs. Helen," she said, settling by the window. I poured tea with ceremonial care. "I've simply given this house back to all of us," I replied, surprised by my own words, yet knowing they were truer than anything Lauren had ever spoken within these walls. Steam curled from our cups, carrying the scent of Earl Grey and memory, and Mrs. Grant's eyes warmed with understanding. "Your husband would be proud," she whispered. The ache of missing him didn't hollow me this time, it steadied me. Helen's Haven opened one golden Thursday afternoon. I stood behind the little counter I had built, wearing my best dress and my mother's pearls, feeling both ancient and brand new. The first guest to cross the threshold was a young woman with paint-stained hands. She shyly asked if she could sit and read. "Of course, dear," I smiled, gesturing toward the pool of sunlight. And with her quiet presence, the house filled with something it had never held before. The comfort of a stranger made welcome. Neighbors followed. Old Mr. Peterson, with his crossword puzzles, the Johnson twins giggling over children's books, ladies from the garden club who remembered my husband's roses. Laughter drifted through the rooms like music. I moved among them lighter than I had in months, watching as my home learned to breathe again. I realized then that this was the legacy my husband intended, not the building itself, but the power to turn shelter into sanctuary. Later, Mrs. Grant came to the counter and lowered her voice. "You know," she said, "I think you've solved something that troubled this whole neighborhood. We all built our own walls. You've shown us safety doesn't come from hiding what we love, it comes from sharing it." Her words fell over me like a blessing. I looked around, the tea set gleaming on its shelf, the books waiting for tomorrow's readers, the air humming with new life. I poured one last cup and sat in the parlor that had once been my fortress but was now my offering. The porcelain touched the saucer with a soft chime, and I finally understood. Legacy isn't something you guard. It's something you give away, until it multiplies beyond anything you could hold alone.